All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to my review of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. For those of you that don't want to stay for the entire in-depth review, my overall opinion and recommendation about this book is get it. If you are a dungeon master, definitely get it. There is so much here you can use to build campaigns. If you are a player, definitely get it. Not only are there new player options, but there is so much here that can help you build your character's backstory and other things that you can use while role-playing as your character, including tips on just how to be a good player in a horror-themed campaign, so definitely could get it. If you are just interested in the lore of D&D, get this. There is so much lore in here. It is astounding. Not only does it have all these different domains of dread that it gives so much information about, but it's got new NPCs. It's got descriptions of the dark powers themselves, new monsters with all these cool histories. It's just amazing. If you just like pretty pictures, the artwork in this is astonishing. Every single chapter has all these amazing pictures, and there are full color maps of like most of the domains of dread, and there's pictures of all the dark lords, and the monsters are creepy as shit, and oh, it's just so good. And if you are just tangentially related to D&D in some way, maybe you watch D&D, or maybe you're just interested in D&D in general, you like the idea of it, or maybe you have a friend that plays D&D, there is so much here for every kind of person that is into D&D. There really is no bad reason to get this. Everyone will get something out of it. Now, for those of you who want a little bit more information, I'm going to go super deep into the things I like about it, things I don't like, which is remarkably limited, and just give you a really good idea of what you're going to be getting if you purchase this book, which again, I recommend wholeheartedly. So, with that being said, let's jump into it specifically. So, the first thing I want to talk about is actually the section called the introduction. I know every one of my videos that has timestamps will literally have a section called intro, but there's an introduction to this book, and most people, when they get one of these source books, will skip the introduction because they think all it is, hi, welcome to the book. This is how you're supposed to use the book, which if you've read any of these books before, you already know how to use one of these books. And they think that's about it. That's not what this introduction is. I mean, it is. I mean, that stuff is in there. But there's so much more to this intro that the introduction space itself is basically a smaller version of the whole book, and it's really cool that it does that. The first section is Welcome to Ravenloft, and it is literally just 5 paragraphs long, but 2 of those paragraphs only have like 5 sentences in them, and they're short. So really, it's only like 3 substantial paragraphs, and then 2 kind of almost paragraphs. The whole thing should take you like 3-ish minutes to read. Maybe 5 if you're really slow, or if you're like me and you read really fast, you can probably get it in a minute and a half. It is that short, but it is so well written, and it sets the stage for Ravenloft in general so well that I would almost go as far to say that if you are DMing or you are planning a session that is going to take place in a domain of dread or just a horror themed game in general, it is not a bad idea to just read through this before you get started, because it gets you in that mood. And it's really well written. This whole book is so incredibly well written to the point where I have an extensive vocabulary. which is one of the reasons my stutter upsets me so much, because a lot of the words I want to use are hard to stay with a stutter. And with my Swiss cheese brain, because of the meds they put me on years ago, I forget the words I want to use a lot, but I know the word exists. And it incredibly frustrates me, because I know there's a word that I want to use that will explain something, but I can't remember what that word is. And it annoys the hell out of me. The reason I say this is I had multiple times where I had to look up words in this book. Not that they use these overly intellectual words or anything like that, but it is so well written that they use the exact word to give the meaning they want to that phrase or that sentence, which is something that is lost on a lot of people, but people that are well read will really enjoy the fact that they use some words that are not used often, but have very, very specific meanings, and they just flow really, really well. And so the whole book it reads incredibly well. And this Welcome to Ravenloft part is just a microcosm of that. Like literally just read it from beginning to end 2 or 3 times. It's just fun to read. After that, you have using this book. Exactly what I said, that this isn't entirely about. Well, it's the second part. And all it is a really, really brief summary of what each chapter is. There are 5 chapters in total in this book. We will go over everyone in detail. Yeah. It is kind of nice, though, that the end of the using this book subchapter or subheading, they do have a letter from Ez Davenier, which we will meet her later when we to talk about new NPCs that are introduced in here. But throughout the book, you will find these letters that not only do they have the letters in there that look like they're handwritten, but they also have generally right next to them or right above or below them, they have them just in the regular D&D font. So if you have a hard time reading the letter itself, you can read it in something significantly easier. So it has the mood, and then it also has a thing for people like me who have double vision, and weird fonts are very difficult for us to read. So the next section is expanded. Another thing it's expanded upon later in the book, but it's called Horror in Your Game. And basically what it is it gives you a brief kind of overview on how to run a horror-themed adventure in D&D. And these tips can be used in any tabletop game. And that's really important, because running a horror-themed game can turn bad very, very quickly. The purpose of horror in general is for the people experiencing it to feel fear while being completely safe, because the fear reaction gives them a slight adrenaline rush, which is fun for most people. So the whole crux of watching horror movies or things like that is you do still need to be safe in some way. If you feel like you are actually in danger or something is actually hurting you, then it's not fun anymore. And because so much of horror is psychological, especially in a tabletop game, it's all going to be psychological. It's very easy to go from torturing the characters and putting them in peril and making the characters feel bad to torturing the players and abusing the players psychologically and verbally and things like that. It's a very fine line. And this Horror in Your Game section gives you a nice kind of outline on how to ensure that you're running a fun horror campaign that people are enjoying, despite the fact that their characters are not enjoying it, rather than a campaign that people feel attacked in, that dredges up memories or feelings that they don't want to deal with or maybe aren't ready to deal with, makes them feel unsafe in some way. Those are things you want to avoid. And that little section is a nice kind of brief explanation of how you can do that. They explain that in greater detail, again, later in the book. And it ends with a letter, which, again, I really like the letters. The other thing in there is the 7 Secrets of Ravenloft, which are just rules that you can kind of use as guidelines for running any campaigns in the setting at all, which are really, really useful and ensure that not only you, but your players as well know what they're getting into, and if there are course corrections that need to be made because the campaign has kind of gone off the rails, you can kind of go back to these 7 Secrets of a Ravenloft and put your campaign right back onto the track without any difficulty. So, cool stuff. And then the final section is called The Land of the Mists, and it basically just kind of gives you the why. I've said this quite a few times on this channel. I don't know how often I've said it in my D&D stuff, but the why is more important than the what. Rules are great. The why behind the rules are more important. And the Land of the Mist section literally tells you why things work the way they do, instead of just this is how things will work. And that information can be used when your players do things that are not expected, which is 90% of the time in a D&D game. So DM specifically, I recommend read the entirety of the Land of the Mists, because even if you don't read the rest of the book, like you just, okay, this is all I'm reading is the introduction, that little section there will give you everything you need to be able to run a Ravenloft themed campaign, because you'll understand the whys behind why everything works, and you can create your own whats based on those whys. You can create your own rules, you can create your own justifications and your own consequences based on the whys that you learn in the Land of the Mists. So very, very cool section. And that's the introduction. Like I said, it's probably the best introduction I've seen. Most of them are kind of interesting and fun to read. This one actually has value, a lot of value. And I literally read the entire thing. Interesting thing about this, Tasha's Culture of Everything took me days to get through, just because of how much information was in there. This one has almost, maybe even more information, which is how much stuff they have on the Domains of Dread. But I read through almost the entire thing in one sitting. Towards the ends of the Domains of Dread, I started skimming instead of reading the entirety of it, because there's just so much there. But it was really hard to not skim because of how well it's written and just how much fun it is to read. So yeah, Chapter 1, Character Creation. This is where most players... Thank you, phone. This is where most players will stop. Which I highly recommend against as we go through the other 2 chapters. I've explained why players should read the other 2 chapters. But this is character creation. This is where your new character options are. And they're good. They're really, really good. So let's cut it down to little subsections. The first little subsections is actually called Haunted Heroes. And basically, the Domains of Dread do not breed adventurers and heroes like other campaign settings do. Like the Forgotten Realms or Eberron, or anything like that, Mystara, Athos, or Athos, however you want to pronounce it, Dark Sun. All of these environments breed heroes and adventurers. They are built to be adventured in. The society itself is built around adventurers. So adventures just happen all the time there. In the Domains of Dread, the entirety of every domain is meant to be built on the idea of punishment and suffering. They're meant to contain great evils. Because of that, adventuring, depending on the domain that you're in, adventuring is kind of looked down upon. And it is definitely not something, in any of them, it is not something that the world really lends itself to. If you're going to be an adventurer in the domains of dread, you're going to have to fight against everything. The reality around you is going to try and discourage you from being an adventurer, which is really cool. And the Haunted Heroes explains how a character might become an adventurer in one of these domains of dread, or how an adventure from another realm, when transitioned to a domain of dread, would have to kind of experience it. You know, the world is going to be against you. People are not going to go, oh, look, adventurers, they can solve my problems. They're going to see, oh, look, adventurers, they're going to cause so many problems. Maybe if we don't talk to them, they'll go away. Like, it's just a negative environment. And so this Haunted Heroes section, again, most people think, oh, it's just fluff. No, read it. Check it out. It's going to give you great insight into the psychology of your character, how they're going to have to respond to the world, and the things they're going to have to deal with. So it's really, really interesting. In addition to Haunted Heroes, they also have new lineages. Now, if you're not, if you don't know what lineages is referring to, I believe, I don't know if they've officially stated this anywhere, but I believe lineage is going to be the word that they use to replace race. If you have the PHB, the Player's Handbook, it'll just say races, and I believe lineages is a new one that they're changing to for reasons that we're not going to talk about here, because it just invites argument and discussion about stuff that's not pertaining to this particular book. And that's what I want to focus on. So with these lineages, we've got 3 new ones, the Dhampir, the Hexblood, and the Reborn. And the interesting thing about these is, yes, all of these can be chosen at character creation, like you would any other lineage. However, all of these lineages have a way to transition a current character into that little lineage, which is really cool. In general, your lineage doesn't change unless you get like a reincarnation spell cast on you or something else really, really big. But there aren't, other than reincarnation, there aren't any actual rules for how to change your character from one lineage to another. But these particular lineages are built on the idea that you may not have started your adventuring career as it, but going to a domain of dread changes you. And in some specific instances, it is a literal physical change. So let's real quick touch on them. The Dhampir is a half creature, half vampire. Most people think of the Dhampirs as half human, half of a vampire, just because in popular culture, that's what they are. Think of Blade from Marvel Comics. He's a Dhampir. Alucard from the Castlevania series is a Dhampir. They're very, very common to the thing. Even like the Underworld series has these half vampires. I don't think they use the term Dhampir, but that's what they are. So that's what this race is half of a vampire. And the race is kind of built around this idea of they have a hunger that they can either choose to satiate or they can choose to fight. But there's multiple hungers they can have. So you don't just have to be, a half vampire that craves blood. They have other things like flesh or raw meat, dreams, life energy, cerebral spinal fluid. Like, you can really be any creature. You just have to have this hunger or thirst for something that acts as a motivating factor that you either have to fight or give into. And then the other aspect of it is how you became a Dhampir. If you were born a Dhampir, they have stuff like that. Again, there are ways to become a Dhampir through alchemy, magic, weird shit. And then, yeah, they have the regular traits and everything like that. They just also will have things that allow you to transition into it or take it at first level. So that's cool. The next one is the Hexblood. If a Dhampir is half vampire, half creature, a Hexblood is kind of like half hag, half creature. It doesn't mean you actually have to literally be half hag or descended from a hag or anything, but hexbloods are connected with hags. Hags are the creepiest creatures in Dungeons and Dragons ever. They are just so creepy. Everything about them is creepy. They make your skin crawl every single time you did a deal with them, if they are played correctly. In addition to that, hags are super dangerous if you fight them as monsters, especially if they are part of a coven. They are really, really dangerous as parts of a coven. Having a character that is so intrinsically connected to one of the more dangerous creatures in D&D is super cool. The interesting thing about this is, again, how you become a hexblood. There's a lot of different ways. You could be the descendant of a hag. It does happen in literature and in lore. It could be that your parents or somebody that had control of you in some way, maybe a foster parent or a guardian of some sort, or an owner, however you want to build your character, made a deal with a hag and you had to pay for it. It could be that you yourself made a deal with a hag and it changed you. There is a justification in here where if a creature wanted to become a hag, a hexblood would kind of be an intermediate phase that they could go through in their transition from powerful spellcaster to hag, similar to how a necromancer might go through some undead changes into becoming a full-blown lich. So yeah, cool stuff. They're really, really creepy to play. I'm going to be blunt in saying if you play a hexblood, you will make people uncomfortable. But yeah, you'll definitely have to check that out. The final new lineage is called Reborn, and it's another one that's really interesting. Reborn is probably the most interesting of the new new lineages, simply because you don't have to be playing a kind of horror themed game for the Reborn to really make sense. Reborn can literally just be a way that you can deal with character death in your adventure, because a Reborn is literally a reincarnation of a previous adventurer. The defining feature of the Reborn, however, is they can't remember their previous life, and it will come back to them sometimes in flashes, sometimes in habits they don't understand. So if you have a character that dies, and they want to continue the character, but the other characters can't raise them for whatever reason, you could have them come back as a Reborn. And the interesting thing about the Reborn is the Reborn doesn't have to even be the same class as the previous one. It is a reincarnation of the character, but they are a new character that just happened to have lived a second life previously. And part of their journey as they go will have to be reconciling with this previous life they had, and whether they want to embrace their former life or reject it and go, no, I'm a completely new being that just happens to have this person's spirit inside of me. That can make for really interesting storytelling. And in a horror themed game, it's just really cool to be depending on how often your characters are dying, which if you're playing something like Curse of Strahd, it's death happens. So if you're on like your 6th or 7th Reborn of the same character, you could get really trippy with it. So yeah. The next section in character creation is the Dark Gifts. Dark Gifts are something that was introduced in Curse of Strahd, which was the 4th adventure hardback that D&D released for 5th edition. And basically what it was, kind of one of the taglines for that series and all the adventures and the Adventures League stuff there was death is not the end. And basically what it was if a character died while in Barovia, the dark powers, which are basically these omnipresent, kind of omniscient, godlike beings that oversee all the different domains of dread in Ravenloft. And their motivations differ depending on who you're asking. But one of the things about the domains of dread is a domain of dread is a prison for a great evil entity, and it's designed to punish everyone inside it. So domains of dread are built along the idea of suffering. And just because you died doesn't mean the dark powers were done making you suffer. So in Curse of Strahd, if your character died, you could bargain with the dark powers to come back, but what would happen is you would have a dark gift given to you when you came back. And to give you an example, one of the dark gifts in Curse of Strahd gave you blind sight. I've talked about this before. Blind sight is really, really useful. It makes most illusion spells ineffective because you can see through them. Invisibility doesn't work on you. Blind sight's super good. But all dark gifts come with a pretty big catch. And the catch for this was the reason you have blind sight is you no longer have eyes. Now, that doesn't mean you just have nothing here. It means your physical eyeballs have been removed from your skull. So everything else is still there, but there's just hollow, empty sockets where your eyes used to be. So because of that, first things first, you have 30 feet of blind sight, but anything outside of that 30 feet, you are blind to. You can no longer see anything further than 30 feet, which is interesting. But in addition to that, you have disadvantage on basically all your charisma checks. I can't remember if it affected your intimidation checks, but I do know persuasion and deception were at disadvantage permanently because you didn't have eyes. And you couldn't hide that fact because of the dark gift. So, yeah, that was an example of a dark gift. The dark gifts in Van Richten's are different. They all... The first section in the dark gifts, after the kind of introduction of them, is called Dark Bargains. And that's kind of the most important part of the dark gifts, is the gifts should be gifts. They give you advantages. They give you things that allow your characters to do things they normally couldn't, but they have drawbacks. And they should be part of a bargain made with the dark powers. And again, the dark powers want suffering. So part of a DM using these dark gifts should be there is a very high cost to getting a dark gift. And that should be a defining feature of it. Is taking a dark gift should not be something that's taken lightly, and should be a very strong decision. The dark gifts themselves, like I said, they do have limitations. They're not nearly as extreme as the dark gifts in Curse of Strahd, and I kind of don't like that. I liked the fact that the Curse of Strahd dark gifts were really good, but also really, really bad, and intrinsically change the character. I'm not saying that there aren't bad parts to these. They're just not quite as bad. And I think because of that, again, depending on how you did deal with them in your KKK campaign, they may cause some imbalancing and encourage other players to take the dark gifts to feel like they're on the same power level, which is not what dark gifts should do. They should be something is like, well, that's cool, but whoa, that's really, really bad. I don't want that. The gift should be a curse at the same time. And I just don't think they go quite far enough with all of them. Some of them are fine, I guess. But overall, I like them. I would probably tweak them a little bit to make them a little bit more than a negative, or at least part of the bargaining phase would have them giving up something rather significant to get their gift. Yeah, overall really cool. And then the subclasses, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here because I'm going to do D&D deep dives on both of them. But suffice it to say, they're awesome. They're really, really cool. I love them. They do massively change how you play those classes, which is what I think, or significant, not massively, but significantly to change how you play those classes. And I think that's what a subclass should do. There should be at least one subclass that kind of exemplifies the vanilla way to play that class. And all of those exist. They're in the basic rules. So you want to play a traditional monk, go with Way of the Open Hand. If you want to play a traditional cleric, be a life cleric. Once you start getting to more and more unique subclasses, they should present very different ways to play your character. And oh boy, the Bard College of Spirits and the Warlock Pact of the Undead offer really cool ways to play different characters. And I love it. They're unique enough that you could have two bards in the same party, and if one's College of Spirits and one is like College of Swords, they are going to feel like completely separate classes. And I love that. Despite the fact they will share a lot of things, they will still act very differently. And I think it's super, super cool. So, yes. The final part of Chapter 1 is backgrounds. And the cool thing about this, they do have two backgrounds listed in here. One of them is effectively a reprint from Curse of Strahd, though they do change a few things in it. It's called the Haunted one. And the other one is the Investigator. Both of them are cool, interesting backgrounds. I did an entire series on backgrounds for D&D Deep Dive. People undervalue your backgrounds a lot. There's a lot more you can do with backgrounds than most players do. Check out these backgrounds. They're fun. However, in addition to that, they have what are called general background features. Every background has what's called a background feature. That is something unique to that background that lets you do something. Like a gladiator can make money fighting just about anywhere. They're built to do that. Or a folk hero can sometimes get free room and board. That's part of their background. Well, these general background features are basically background features that you can replace if you want to have a little bit more of a sinister themed character. They're really, really cool. And they help you customize your background even more. Any background you can customize. There's rules, I believe, in either the Player's Handbook or the DMG. I can't remember which. I believe it's the Player's Handbook, that allow you to customize your background by picking different features into the things like that, or creating your own backgrounds. Those are all clear and good. But these new general background features are just really cool and are a great way to play a unique character without having to get really, really complicated by building your own thing. Just go, okay, well, I'm going to be a knight, but instead of my regular background feature, I'm going to have the Mist Wanderer background feature and be a knight that travels between domains of dread. I like that. I think it's as interesting. So, and that is Chapter 1. Again, most players are only going to read Chapter 1, and that's great. It's a great chapter, but going further, there's cooler stuff out there. The second chapter is called Creating Domains of Dread, and that is literally what it's about. Again, they list a bunch of domains of dread. There are 17 domains of dread that they list everything in there. Most, all but I think one has a full color map of the domain. They talk about different different towns and the things in there and locations. They talk about the Dark Lord and their motivations and all those things. So those are really cool. However, you may want to create your own domain of dread. I have done this myself in one of my campaigns. They're currently in a domain of dread, and I'm having a blast with it. But I cannot tell you how much I have learned just from reading this creating domains of dread section, and it has influenced my already written and created domain of dread. It's a really interesting setting, chapter, and also, again, this is the why behind the what. If you are running a game in any domain of dread, whether it is yours or a pre-made one, whatever, or just this is a really, really good resource to understand why the domains are the way they are and how to deal with those points when your players do something unsuspected. Overall, it has rules for creating a Dark Lord, which is the purpose of a domain of dread is to imprison a Dark Lord. A Dark Lord is something so evil that the dark powers have taken it out of wherever it came from and trapped it in its own reality it can never escape from. That's why Dark Lords are so important. They're intrinsically tied to their domain. And so creating a Dark Lord is an intrinsic part of your domain of dread. And understanding what a Dark Lord is an intrinsic part of knowing what to do when you are running an adventure like that. So really, really cool. It does something that I really enjoy when creating characters is it gives you just a list of questions that you can choose to answer or choose not to answer, but they really frame the character in a very complete manner. One of the ways I create characters sometimes is literally asking a bunch of questions like I'm interviewing either the character or I'm interviewing someone about the character, like I'm interviewing an author about the character they wrote. And it's a really great way to create these really fully fleshed out characters. And they do that here. They give you ideals, bonds, and flaws that you can use for them. They describe kind of the corruption and the kind of beyond redemption aspect of these Dark Lords. They even give you inspiration on how the birth of the Dark Lord would happen. Because even Strahd, who is the first Dark Lord, was a normal human being at one point. And because of the choices that he made, he became a Dark Lord. So that point where they transition, where the Dark Lord in their history, which happens before the domain of dread exists, that point in the character's history where they go from maybe being an adventurer to being a Dark Lord is really important. So they have a very short section on that as well, but everything kind of feeds into that idea. And then the second half of this chapter is creating the domain itself. If you want a real life example of how to create a domain of dread, Wizards of the Coast actually had Taliesin Jaffe, one of the members of Critical Role and just a very cool person in general. Worked with, I believe, Amy Dallin, who is one of the coolest people ever, and I love her. They had them do a live stream that I believe at least the first part of it is on the Wizards of the Coast YouTube channel. If you want to see practical application of this stuff, check that out. The second half of this chapter is actually talking about genres of horror, which will help you to kind of define your domain. And it will also help you because when they describe the domains of dread, they say what genres it is. So by reading up on the genres, you can kind of get a better idea of how the world itself should work. And the different genres they list here in detail are things like body horror, cosmic horror, dark fantasy, folk horror, ghost stories, and gothic horror. They also have a few other horror genres that they don't go into as much detail, but it gives you a ton of stuff to work with. In addition to just describing the setting of that genre of horror, they also give you monsters that fit that setting. And oh wow, are some of these monsters terrifying. And they draw, when they list the monsters in here, they will actually tell you what book they appear in as well. So some of the monsters they list for these, like I'm in body horror because it's the first one. And body horror is terrifying because it's all about weird things happen to your body, unexplained growths, and just it is a disgusting genre of horror, one that I am not a fan of because it actively terrifies me. And because of my panic disorder, I actually don't like being afraid because I'm always afraid, and it's very much not an enjoyable experience for me. These monsters are just incredible. So they have things like the Carrionet, which is basically a living toy. So that's creepy. And that's one of the new monsters in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. However, they also have the Gibbering Mouther, which is a monster from the Monster Manual. It just fits the theme really, really well. So for this particular thing, they have a bunch of different monsters. And these are just examples. These are not the only monsters you can use. They're just monsters that fit really well. They have a bunch of different examples. These ones specifically are only from Van Richten's and the Monster Manual. Other ones will pull from other things as well, but it'll tell you exactly where to find it if you want to be able to use that monster. After the monsters, they will have a section on villains that fit this. Now, this is not describing the Dark Lord. This is describing the other bad guys in the setting. If you're in Barovia, where Stradvan Zazarovich is the Dark Lord, he's not the only bad guy you have to deal with. As your characters level up, they will deal with increasingly bad things. And the villain section in each one of these gives you a bunch of kind of templates that you can build a sub-villain for your adventures, which is especially useful if you are running a campaign in a Domain of Dread, because they need escalating, they need to grow before they can challenge the Dark Lord itself. Or if you're just running a one-shot and you don't want them dealing with the Dark Lord. The Dark Lords are all extremely powerful. So if you're not running a tier 3 or tier 4 campaign, they're probably not going to be able to deal with a Dark Lord. And they shouldn't be able to. Having that ultimate evil that is so far beyond their abilities that they can't hope to defeat them is a great thing in a horror-themed campaign. So yeah, the villain section is super great for giving those smaller villains something that's going to fit within the theme. They have a section called Torments, which basically is just bad shit that can happen to the characters or can just happen in the setting that just make it that much more terrifying. They have what's called body horror setting, which is basically different settings that could have a body horror story in it. Just because your genre is body horror doesn't mean that it all are. And this is for everyone. I'm going through the body horror section, but every single genre has these things. So the setting itself is kind of like the country or the domain itself. The section after that is adventure site, which are smaller things. So places where smaller delves or adventures can happen within the larger setting. And then the final section is plots that could either get them introduced to the adventure genre, or just motivate them if they're already there. So for each one of the genres that I talked about, they have that for each one. They have a monster section, they have a villain section, they have a torment section, a setting section, and an adventure site section, and then a plot section, which is really, really good. Even if you are already running an adventure in a pre-established domain of dread, you can use all of these to create some really fun adventures. So that is chapter 2, and I need to drink. So much nicer. Whew. Chapter 3 is the domains of Ravenloft. The domains of Ravenloft are literally that. Most people, when they hear Ravenloft, they think of Castle Ravenloft. Castle Ravenloft is the castle of Strahd, and it was the first domain of dread. The first Ravenloft adventure was released, I think, in '85, so it predates Castlevania by a few years. But it predates second edition D&D. It came out in the first edition of D&D. And it was just Barovia. They were synonymous. But as things developed, they started creating new domains of dread. And that's what Chapter 3 is Ravenloft technically refers to all the domains of dread, not just Barovia, which is the specific domain of dread of Strahd von Zarovich, and the domain and the first domain of dread, not only in history as far as Dungeons and Dragons, but Strahd is considered the first Dark Lord. What he did to become a Dark Lord is what spawned, which is what started the dark powers in imprisoning significantly evil creatures in these domains of dread. So Barovia is important, and it's listed in here. It is the first domain that they talk about in detail, but the first section of the Domains of Ravenloft specifically talks about Ravenloft as a whole. It talks about the mists. The mists are a thing in every single domain. It's what limits the domain. It talks about what happens when you get into the mist. It talks about mist talismans. It talks about magic and metaphysics in the mists. Like, it's a really, really interesting thing. And if your character is something like they took that background feature, that means they're a mist traveler, understanding how the mists work is an important thing. So players can get a lot out of that particular section if their character wouldn't know it. And it also talks about Ezra, which is basically the god of the mists. Read up on Ezra. It is a god that is limited to Ravenloft in general. And it's interesting. People aren't quite sure if Ezra is real, if Ezra is a dark power. No, nothing. It's confusing. And it's cool. It's super, super cool. So check out Ezra. Now, after that, like I said, there are 17 different domains of dread. Each one are ones that are listed in great detail. Each domain of dread will have a section called Noteworthy Features, which kind of gives you an overview of what people that were born and live in this domain of dread think about the domain. And this section specifically is really, really useful for players if they want their character to have been born in a domain of dread. Now, just because you're not playing a Ravenloft campaign doesn't mean that your character couldn't have been born in a domain of dread. And what I mean by that is, again, the domains of dread are designed to torture and inflict suffering. But they exist outside of the multiverse, in a sense, in the idea that domains of dread can connect with any campaign setting. And because of that, your character might have escaped your domain of dread, specifically because it would cause suffering. Perhaps you pissed off the Dark Lord, and the Dark Lord wants vengeance against you, and the Dark Powers decided if they excised you from the domain of dread, it would cause suffering for the Dark Lord, because now he can't get his vengeance, which is he or she, which is what they want. It could be that you were excised for your own suffering. You're cut off from everything you know, everything you've grown up with. Now, you've been sent to a place that is significantly better because the world is not built to cause you suffering, but it will cause you suffering because you don't get to see your loved ones or anything like that. So part of being born in a domain of dread is going to be suffering as a part of your life. But I strongly encourage the DMs, let your players be from domains of dread, even in campaigns that are not any way related to Ravenloft, because it will add a very interesting storytelling element, especially as they deal with the fact that the entirety of existence is not trying to make them suffer. That's just a cool thing to deal with. Yeah, so they have noteworthy features. That section is really important for players. They'll have generally they will have a settlements and sites, which is where your map of it is. I believe only one doesn't have a map because it's a giant wasteland. And then they'll have a section that just talks about, different sites and places like that. They'll have a section on the Dark Lord itself, generally with a really, really pretty picture of the Dark Lord. And in addition to giving the Dark Lord's history, it will talk about their powers and dominion, because they are intrinsically connected to their domain, and their torment. Again, these domains are designed to trap, imprison, and punish these permanently evil characters. The thing about a Dark Lord is they are beyond redemption. They can never learn from their mistakes. The choices they made that turned them into a Dark Lord are permanent. And because of that, there is a torment built in to the setting. And I love that. I think it's super, super cool. And then they will have a section on role-playing the Dark Lord, because your players will interact with the Dark Lord in some way or fashion. Again, the Dark Lord controls the entire domain. They can't leave, but they control everything. They can even close the borders to ensure that your players can't leave. So, and then the final section is going to be an adventures in section, which will just give you ideas of adventures that could happen. And they're all super cool and useful. I'm not going to go through every single one of them because, again, there's so much to this book. But some of the ones that I just thought were massively cool. Obviously, Barovia. I love Barovia. Castlevania is one of my favorite series of all time. And Barovia is D&D Castlevania, despite the fact that Castlevania was created after Barovia. And I think it's the first Castlevania game. It's either the first or the second. I can't remember which. Actually got into a lot of legal trouble because I think it was the American art for the NES cartridge literally stole the Ravenloft artwork from the first Ravenloft adventure and used it as their cover art. So they're very, very intrinsically linked. And because I love Castlevania, I love Barovia. It's a super cool thing. If you want to adventure in Barovia, this gives you everything you need to run adventures in Barovia. But if you want something a little more structured, pick up Curse of Strahd. It is brilliant. And it actually has a mechanic in it where part of the adventure is randomized and is decided by using a Taroka deck, which is basically a tarot deck in D&D. And I think I got the Taroka deck by buying, pre-ordering, I bought it with Curse of Strahd because you need it to run the adventure. They have explanations on how you can use it regular to the deck of cards, but the adventure itself will change based on when you decide to run it. You will deal 5 cards from the Taroko deck, and that will decide major antagonists. It will decide where certain items are that are important to completing the adventure. It's a super cool adventure that if you've never run it, you should. But in addition to Barovia, ones that I really, really enjoyed, Blutspur is super, super interesting. Simply because it is a realm that is basically a wasteland. Everyone lives underground, and the people that live there are all mind flayers that are trying to keep the God Brain, which is a super messed up mega mind flayer thing. It's a giant brain that is dying because it did things that it shouldn't have, and it learned the things that it shouldn't have. And it is terrifying. There was another one that I thought was super. Was it Harakir? Harakir is mummies. You wanted to deal with like Egyptian themed stuff and fighting mummies and all that. Harakir's for you. I think Darkon was the other one that I thought was super cool. Oh yeah, so Darkon. Darkon doesn't have a Dark Lord. The Dark Lord in there, I think, was destroyed permanently. Which generally isn't supposed to happen. Dark Lords are defined by the fact that they are effectively immortal. They can die over and over again, but they'll always come back. Darkon, he screwed up so bad that he obliterated himself. And so it is a domain of dread that is slowly being lost to the mist. It is literally just floating islands in the mist. And the hope, and people just kind of ignore the fact that the world is slowly disappearing, and it's so cool. Like I said, there's tons of them. In addition to those, they have a crap ton of others. I haven't counted them, but they have a section called Other Domains of Dread, which just gives a much shorter description of a bunch of other ones. The one that caught my eyes is the first one, but it's just really interesting. It's called Sire 1313, the Morning Rail. It is a domain that is entirely on a train of the dead. It's super cool. It really is. And again, the description of that is literally a paragraph with a couple other things. So to run something in that domain, you're going to have to do a lot more work on your end, but it's still super, super cool. So that's chapter 3, super cool. And like I said, players should be reading at least parts of chapter 3 if they intend to create a character from that domain, because it will massively help you. The final part of chapter 3 that I completely forgot. It's called Travelers in the Mist. And it's a bunch of groups and NPCs that travel, that exist either in multiple domains or can travel between domains. They have things like the Vistani, who are known to travel between the mists. They are known most often because of Barovia, because they and Strahd have a thing. But they can travel they are adept at traveling between the mists. So yeah, cool stuff that they're there. They also have a bunch of NPCs that they call Mist Wanderers. These are particular characters that specifically have learned to travel between domains of dread and other places. And so they could show up in any campaign. They could show up outside Ravenloft as a way to encourage people to go into one of the domains of dread. Like, it's just, they're interesting. They do have Rudolf van Richten. They have his whole thing here. So if you want to know more about Van Richten himself, he's here. They have his kids in here. They have a bunch of other really, really awesome NPCs in here that you can just insert into your character. So overall, very, 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 very cool. Chapter 4 is Horror Adventures. And this is the chapter that really goes into great detail about how to run a horror adventure. And not only does it have kind of the practical stuff of like, here's how you can create here's how you can keep suspense up. Here's how you can run monsters that will keep people scared. These are the kind of things you can be doing. But it also has an entire section that talks about how to set expectations, basically understanding what horror is. A lot of people, when they hear horror, they just think, oh, I scare people. But no, like I said in the beginning of this review, horror is much more about than just fear. Horror is being able to experience adrenaline rushes from the fight or flight response, specifically the flight response, without being in any real danger and in a controlled environment. As someone that suffers from panic disorder, I experience fight or flight constantly. I get panic attacks multiple times a day. And because I don't get to control when they happen, they're extremely debilitating and uncomfortable for me. So the fact that I don't have control over them is what makes them so uncomfortable, because they will come at times when I don't want them to, and they will prevent me from doing things I want to do. That is literally the definition of a panic disorder. Now, the fight or flight response is a good thing. It is hardwired into our bodies because it gives us extra energy when we need it. And being able to experience that rush of energy, that expanded awareness from hypervigilance, can be fun if you do it on purpose. And that is the entire purpose behind horror. People go to a horror movie to get scared on their terms. And that's the whole thing about running a horror-themed D&D game or tabletop game, is it should be scary. It should be unsettling, but it has to be controlled. They still have to feel that they are in control in a small way. They are voluntarily doing this. As soon as it moves from controlled to uncontrolled, it becomes a negative experience. And it's very, very easy for that to happen when the DM has so much control. And the players might voluntarily somewhat relinquish some of that control to the DM, and the DM can abuse it. So if you are planning on running a Ravenloft campaign, read at least for Chapter 4, read Preparing for Horror, everything underneath Preparing for Horror, Running Horror Games, and After the Horror. It's a bit of a read, but it will help you to understand the ways that are okay to scare your players, and definitely their characters, and ways that you need to avoid actually causing abuse to happen. So that I really, really like, and I really think is important. The rest of this chapter is just cool stuff. They have a thing called the Horror Toolkit, which has things like curses. Curses are super, super fun to deal with, because it gives the players a massive motivation to deal with something, because the curse is going to cause their character to have bad things happen to them until they fix it. And the curses, they talk about things like the components of a curse, and just how to make a good curse. And then they give some samples of curses as they would work in D&D, and they're great. They're really, really, really great. I think curses are a great part of a horror-themed campaign, because, again, the whole world should feel stacked against the players. It shouldn't be completely stacked. They should be able to triumph, because that, at the end, a horror story is about triumphing over the horror. Even if that triumph is simply the story ending, there should be a triumph in there. That's why people wanted to do this. But yeah, curses are super cool. And then they have stuff about like a section on fear and stress that talks about how to keep the stakes up and make people afraid, because scaring people is not just going boo. Creating a sense of fear is an art form. It really, really is. And so this gives you a little bit better idea on how to do that. They have a section on haunted traps, which are super, super cool. And then they have a new section called Survivors, which is a new mechanic. Survivors are kind of like sidekicks, but they're even more limited. They can only get up to level 3, and they're specifically designed to tell like side stories, maybe like a flashback, like what you would see in maybe Lost or something, where you're talking about an earlier version of a character that doesn't have all the skills and abilities of a new one, or maybe allowing the players, instead of reading about a tragedy, allowing the players to experience a tragedy with by being able to play a survivor character. Basically, the way they work is the survivor, they get a stat block. It's literally a monster stat block. And that is their character for this little short adventure. The stat block levels up. And when you level up, you can choose what's called a survivor talent. At second level and at third level, your character can choose a survivor talent, which changes how the character plays. The characters themselves, again, are weak. They're designed to make you feel very powerless, but they're super effective storytelling tools to be able to tell a story and have bad things happen without having to endanger the player characters at all. And yeah, they're really, really cool. The final adventure for 5th edition, or not 5th edition, 4th edition to D&D was called The Madness of Gardmore Abbey. And the adventure itself centered around the Deck of Many Things and this abbey where someone collected the Deck of Many Things and used it and pulled the Ruin card. The Ruin card does exactly what it sounds like. It causes ruin, and it decimated the abbey. And so the adventure itself is built around finding the different cards and reassembling the deck. And during it, you have to deal with a beholder and a red dragon and another party of adventurers that is also attempting to rebuild the deck. And you have to see which one of you can rebuild it first and whether or not you're going to use the Deck of Many Things. It's a super cool adventure. Well, in Dungeon Magazine, and I still have the adventure. I have the Madness of Darkmoor Abbey. Or Gardmore Abbey. I have the physical adventure. It's where I got, this is one of my favorite possessions of all time. This is my Deck of Many Things. It is an actual full deck of many things. It has all the cards. I love this deck. It's not in great shape because I've had it for years. But I love it. I think it is one of my favorite things in the world because if I ever introduce a Deck of Many Things into my Giga games, I can actually draw cards. But in Dungeon Magazine, they actually had an adventure that described the events that led up to the ruin of Gardmore Abbey. And in it, they actually had pre-generated characters that all your players would play. So if you wanted to play the Madness of Gardmore Abbey, you could start with this one-shot adventure. Because the Madness of Gardmore Abbey was almost a campaign in itself. It was not a full campaign, but it was pretty darn close. It was a long adventure. And so you could play this one-shot to experience what happened. Instead of just telling the players what happened, they could experience it as these characters. And so using these survivors, you can do literally that. If you want to have an adventure where something really, really bad happened, you can have them experience the event that ruined this place. They can find a magic book or something that takes them in, and they can play these survivor characters and live through it, and then go back to their normal characters. I love it. I think it's super, super cool, super interesting. Definitely going to be using that. The final part of Horror Adventures is the House of Lament mini adventure. I have not read over the whole thing. But the last mini adventure they had in Curse of Strahd, they have a mini adventure called Death House. Takes you from level 1 to level 3, gets you ready for Curse of Strahd. It is amazing. I've run it myself. It is by far one of my favorite one-shots to run because it is freaky. It is so well written. I think Chris Perkins wrote that one. I have no idea who wrote this one. I'll see if they list the author. They don't. Or at least not in that section. But it's an adventure. Use it. That particular area just for DMs. I can't really say much more than it's for DMs, but it's an adventure. It gets you set up for Ravenloft stuff. It's cool. Finally, Chapter 5 is Monsters of Ravenloft. This is the bestiary. It's cool. Like, there's nothing I can say about it beyond it's just cool. They do have an entire section before you get to the bestiary, which talks about things like, they have a whole section called Describing Monsters, which is specifically just saying, oh, a beholder appears. It's kind of boring. But, to take one from here, you could say, oh, a vampiric mind flayer up appears. Vampiric mind flayers are terrifying. Mind flayers are terrifying. Vampiric mind flayers are even more terrifying. And yeah, if the players know what it is, they might be, oh no! But describing the monster before naming it, or maybe never even actually naming it, so much more effective. It's what I do anytime my players meet monsters. I won't tell them the name. I will just describe it. And they specifically give you a guide on how to describe horror monsters. Things like emphasize the wrongness, engage all the senses, make it personal. It's so good. Even if you never run a horror-themed campaign, read this little section. It's like 5 paragraphs, but it's so worth it because it helps you to understand how to really introduce monsters to your players. And then there's the monsters. They're so cool. I think one of the coolest ones, they have a thing called a lesser and a greater star spawn emissary. This is a Cthulhu monster. It is so amazing. It's just, it's beyond cool. And then there's so many cool creatures. I believe most, if not all, have amazing renderings of them. So they have pictures. Yeah, it's just, I think it's most of them have pictures, so you could see how creepy they are. You could even show them to the players. Like, it's just cool. So yeah, I'm not going to talk much more about that chapter just because it is what it is. It's a bestiary. The monsters are great. They're interesting. They will definitely add some amazing stuff to the game. And yeah, players don't really need to read this section because it just will give them information that will help them cheat to be effective. But DMs definitely should read that. And then there is an appendix where they have what's called a spirit board. It's basically a Ouija board. I'm not a big fan of Ouija boards, so I won't use this, but they do describe how to implement using a Ouija board or a spirit board. In Chapter 4, they have a section called the Taroka deck and spirit board. So yeah, that's why they have that in there. Kind of cool. And then the credits. So yeah, it's a really long review, I know, but I like getting into the nitty gritty of it and talking about how amazing this book is because it is so well written. I want to run a campaign in every domain of Dread. Seriously, they are that well written and that interesting. There's so many cool things, and like there's one that's a dream world, and then there's one that's all about high society. And if you, if your high society masks slips, then the Dark Lord will disintegrate you, and like it's just cool. It's so cool. Like I said, this is probably the best book they have published yet. It does it does show that Wizards of the Coast is not just understanding 5th edition. Wizards of the Coast is growing as storytellers, to be blunt. They are learning how to tell stories more effectively in their medium, and it shows in this book. It is just so well written, well illustrated, well designed, well laid out. It is a brilliant, brilliant book. It should be a best-selling book. Yeah, I can't wait for other people to get it because it is that good. But anyway, that is all for me today. As always, if you enjoyed this, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn notifications on. In the comments down below, tell me what excites you the most about this book. There's so much to be excited about. Let me know. Otherwise, that's all for me, and I will see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.